Hi, I'm Katie Miranda, the host of the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit, and today I'm here with Max Blumenthal. Max is an author, speaker, journalist, and is the senior editor of the Gray Zone Project, a news site dedicated to investigative journalism and analysis. He's also the host of the Moderate Rebels podcast. So, Max, you've done a lot of really extensive journalism and research in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel. Can you tell us from your experience what resistance or solidarity tactics are actually working and producing results for people on the ground or, in the international community, in the political arena? Um, yeah.
Well, it just occurred to me. I didn't even think of this, but I'm actually drinking a coffee out of this mug I got in Gaza earlier this year. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I bought it. It's a Carlos Latouf cartoon, and it's called Once Upon a Time in Rafah. Classic Carlos Latouf cartoon. People in Gaza pay attention to, the international solidarity movement, and they're really into Carlos Latouf. And his cartoons are also on walls in Belfast, where there's a giant mural that he drew of a Palestinian prisoner reaching through the bars of his cell to clasp the hand of an Irish Republican Army prisoner from H Block, reaching through his bars to, clasp the hand of the Palestinian prisoner, and both, expressing solidarity of, people under occupation. So, they're also there's this internationalist spirit, and that's kind of something I want to talk about. But the most important thing that we've done in the West, in terms of Palestine solidarity, obviously, is the BDS movement. When I started covering Palestine as a journalist in 2009, I was just learning what BDS was, and I didn't take it very seriously. I went to the West Bank and met some of the people at Badil back in like May 2009, and started to I saw it as a very fringe phenomenon. A year later, I realized BDS was really the only game in town, and now it's played a real role in kind of mainstreaming some aspects of Palestine solidarity within the West. In the Gaza Strip, it's not really a factor. And throughout much of the West Bank, because they're besieged, and you go into a shop in the Gaza Strip, and much of the food has Hebrew writing on it. I mean, much of the packaged food, they have no choice but to import food from Israel, otherwise they won't have food. However, they have developed a consciousness about BDS, and there are signs. There are some stores. I remember during Operation Protective Edge, when I was in Gaza, some stores were starting to refuse to sell Israeli goods. And I even saw this take place in Jericho, which is not a city in the West Bank that has that big of a tradition of resistance and is considered more of a resort. So BDS has penetrated some unlikely places. I think it was at a high point on campus in 2015, and I don't see the same level of activity. I can talk about why. I think there have been some serious missteps within the Palestine solidarity movement as it institutionalizes and starts to mainstream more. And I also think that there isn't the same understanding in the West as there is among Palestinians I know and I've encountered in the refugee camps around Beirut, or in the West Bank, Gaza, or inside Israel proper, about the importance of anti-imperialism in the Palestinian struggle.
And part of this telesummit is, well, I mean, the focus of this telesummit is really like what is working and what's not. And you mentioned like some of the problems that you've seen in the solidarity movements. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, one of the things that has been working, well, first of all, one of the most important tactics that I saw was doing divestment drives on campus. Just a basic thing. A lot of other movements do it, and it provides for a lot of opportunity for coalition building. And I've been a part of that. I remember speaking at the University of Michigan and just seeing a line around the block and 600 people fill up this hall for a divestment hearing that, of course, was going to lose because the Student Government Council is packed with these careerist shills and like just like the worst people in America pack the Student Government Council. And many of them went on to like vacations and fellowships provided for by APAC. But
Wow.
the point of and which is completely unethical and should be grounds for them to be um, you know for them to be forced to resign or sanctioned by the school. But in any case, it was a really effective educational mechanism, and it was live streamed, so thousands of people were watching, and that was what was happening across the country and in Canada and Europe as well, but particularly in North America. And I think it was a really effective mechanism that helped give rise to groups like If Not Now, this Jewish group, which doesn't share the same politics as me and is very tribalistic, in some ways, just a little bit too Jewish focused when this is really about Palestinians, but they are playing an important role too in waking people up in areas that were completely shut off to the narrative of Palestine solidarity. And I think they came out of that whole campus movement of where a lot of younger Jews who were forced to come out of the communal boundaries that they'd been trapped in high school because they went to Jewish schools, met different people on campus, went to these divestment hearings and heard Palestinians testify, and they decided they could no longer support Zionism. So that was a really effective tactic. Another effective tactic was the deadly exchange initiative that Jewish Voice for Peace is doing, which was basically consolidating a lot of the work that had been going on within, I guess you could say, broadly the left on Israeli training of police and domestic security. And it really has helped build solidarity between Black activists and Palestine solidarity activists to draw that connection. But there have been areas of disconnection and disruption that I want to talk about as well. There's been a deliberate effort, particularly since 2016. And when I say deliberate, I mean like systematic, calculated, planned, probably well-funded counterinsurgency effort to break connections between the Palestine solidarity movement in the West and historic resistance movements in the Middle East and throughout the global South. And it started with Syria. There are specific organizations that played a role in trying to either convince people in the Palestine solidarity movement that regime change in Syria would be a good idea, that it would be a good idea to replace the government of a frontline resistance state, which had supported resistance against Israel through Hezbollah, through Liwa al-Quds, a Palestinian organization, and basically had been a key target on the regime change target board of the neoconservatives, that it would be a good idea to replace that government with a more Western-friendly and Gulf-friendly government, a government backed by the Gulf states who are like the principal enemies of Palestine in the Arab world. This campaign was, targeted me when I decided that this organization known as the White Helmets, which was funded to the tune of about $100 million by the British Foreign Office and the U.S. State Department to, government arms that have played a principal role in crushing the Palestinian national movement, that this organization was actually not just simply a bunch of life-saving Gandhian rescuers, but that it was an arm of the Syrian armed opposition playing or acting as an international influence organization to tug at heartstrings in the West and manipulate media coverage in order to provide momentum for Western military intervention in Syria, which would have been devastating for Palestine. I mean, if we're just talking about it in the Palestinian context. And I was treated to this really cowardly petition, which wouldn't even name me or anyone who supported my factual reporting, where Palestine solidarity activists and people who are really at the forefront of Palestine organizing were pressured to sign this document denouncing the allies we're not proud of,
Hmm. I
and
never
pledging
heard of
to,
that actually.
yeah, well, you can look it up. It's still around. I'm sure most of those people wouldn't really want to be associated with this anymore. Many of them wouldn't. And I'll explain why. But they had pledged to never work with people who opposed regime change in Syria,
Oh,
as I
wow.
did. So it was effectively a blacklist, and it was basically saying, Students for Justice in Palestine groups should not host people like me. Rania Khalek, someone who I think played an instrumental role in doing a lot of the reporting on the Israeli training of police forces in the U.S.
Hmm.
And I wrote, I think, the first major feature on this phenomenon. She was actually forced to, there were pressure campaigns that forced Students for Justice in Palestine groups to unbook her, I think at the University of North Carolina. Um, this had a really destructive role. I can't say that it's directly responsible for this, but I can say it had an indirect role in the fact that, according to the Israel on Campus Coalition, which is the arm of AIPAC that monitors what goes on campus and fights Palestine solidarity on campus, divestment drives on campus, which I talked about as being this really important tactic,
Hmm.
have gone down since 2015 at a factor of 50%. So if
Wow.
50% less divestment drives, I really do feel a little less momentum on around campus, and there is a divide in the movement. But it's really important for people to look back at it. What happened here? The white helmets last month, for about 400 of them, I don't even know if they're really white helmets, were evacuated by Israel, by the Israeli military intelligence apparatus through the occupied Golan Heights to Jordan, the ultimate collaborationist state. That totally vindicated what I was saying about the white helmets and showed what they really were. And it should be the source of extreme embarrassment to the people who are behind this internal fragmentation campaign. Um, the rest of the white helmets are in Afrin, which is a Turkish occupied area that was invaded by the Turkish military and which proceeded to loot the city center and ethnically cleanse the Kurdish population. So this is who the white helmets were. I think there should be some recognition that using Syria to divide Palestinians was not just a terrible idea, but it was contrary to the imperatives of the Palestinian national movement, which requires stable state support within the Arab world to exist. And so I'd also, direct people to what's going on in Latin America, where there's many of the same elements in the United States are pushing regime change operations against Venezuela and Nicaragua. They've achieved kind of a change in the government in Ecuador, as well as Argentina and Brazil, but particularly in Nicaragua and Venezuela. These are governments that have stood up for Palestine at the UN, that have a historical connection to Palestine, that have really been a source of annoyance to Israel's foreign ministry and to the United States. And they deserve to be defended by people in Palestine who support the Palestinian national movement or are involved in Palestinian solidarity activities. But there's very little recognition of kind of anti-imperialism as an important form of defending the Palestinian struggle. There are also organizations that exist specifically to shatter anti-imperialism within the left broadly, but also within Palestine solidarity circles. One of them is the International Solidarity Organization, which is a Trotskyist organization. It's more like a Shachtmanite Trotskyist organization. Max Shachtman was the kind of foreign secretary for Leon Trotsky. He supported the U.S. during the Cold War. He supported the U.S. in the Korean War, when the U.S. Sought to destroy socialism on the Korean Peninsula and the independence of the Korean people. And this organization is infected with that philosophy, and it favors regime change pretty much everywhere, and always winds up supporting the American imperative in a place like Syria, in a place like Cuba. They have ideologues in this organization that favors the overthrow of the Cuban government. They recently put out a statement supporting regime change in Nicaragua. Everywhere you look, this organization is supporting the Washington consensus while they're pushing this socialist philosophy on campus and saying that they support Palestine. And they even hosted me one year at
Mm-hmm.
their socialism conference before I understood what their politics were about. I look at these organizations with enormous suspicion. I think they're playing the role of counterinsurgency and playing a very divisive role within Palestine solidarity. And I would encourage other people to look at them similarly, and also ask yourself who shows up outside one of the most important protest movements uh, inside Palestine solidarity, Occupy APAC, or the anti-APAC protests each year in Washington. Just pay attention to who shows up and who doesn't show up.
I want to go back to what you were saying about how you and Ronnie Achalek were sort of blacklisted on campuses. And I actually have something to say about this in general. I don't know specifically about what happened to you guys, but what I have seen online is a lot of really vile hatred and judgment within the Palestine solidarity community in the West. And it's not just on the issue of Syria, it's on, a lot of different issues where if somebody doesn't have the exact same opinion as you about something, they're judged very, very harshly. And for me personally, I don't want to participate in any of that because I think it's like a really devastating force of destruction. And what surprises me is like all this negativity towards people who should be really coming together and who claim to be working towards one goal, the liberation of Palestine. They're destroying each other from within. And I just find it sad and kind of ironic that that hatred is reserved for each other rather than, hatred of the apartheid state, or of the concept of apartheid, if you will. Um, so for me, that's definitely been one of the, things that I've seen that hasn't been working. Do you have anything else to say about that?
No, I mean, I agree. And I would just say that the hatred really went one way. And it was organized by a small group of people who had an echo chamber, who were dedicated principally towards pushing regime change in Syria, and were using the United States and the UK as a base for doing so, the same way that right-wing Miami Cubans, have used the US as kind of a sanctuary for driving regime change against government in a country that they took exile from. And, I know who these people are. Some of them are still nested in Palestine solidarity organizations, and they have faced no consequences for this. And their actual goals have been exposed as operationally the same goals as Israel's at this point. And so they need to be, this needs to be recognized that there has been a counterinsurgency campaign waged by principally Syrian regime change trolls, as well as other, extremely ideologically right-wing elements within the Palestine solidarity movement that have done great damage and have ultimately lined up with the imperatives of Israeli foreign policy. It wasn't us running around trolling people and attacking everyone for their views on Syria. I was just doing reporting, and the then I became the target of this campaign. I mean, it was such a systematic campaign that I received threatening phone calls from people who I had no idea how they got my number before I published my article on the White
Wow.
Helmets. Like, so, we're talking about, an attack on me before anything even happened to
Mm-hmm.
intimidate me against publishing factual journalism. And I'm not seeking revenge on anyone right now. What I'm saying is that we people who actually care about the long-term survival of Palestine solidarity as a movement and the Palestinian struggle on the ground need to uh, understand what's being done to divide their movement so that it doesn't happen again. Because there will be these kind of windows of opportunity for people who seek to divide and fragment, and they'll try to exploit them. And there needs to be pushback next time.
So I want to switch to another topic now. You have somewhat of an insider's view on Washington and Washington politics that most of us, will never have. What have you seen or heard, like in terms of what's going on in Washington and Congress, in terms of people moving more towards supporting the liberation of Palestine and moving away from APAC? Like, is there anything like that going on? Like, kind of hush hush, or, what's going on?
Great question. There's this neocon Likudnik online outlet called the Free Beacon, very obviously pro Bibi, and they reported on a book party that my parents threw for me back in 2013 or early 2014. I guess it was in 2013 after my book Goliath came out. There's a lot of debate around my book Goliath. Liberal Zionists like Eric Alterman came out really hard against it. And then the Israel lobby itself just came against me, and they were furious that my parents had ordered pizza for me and provided operational support to these anti-Zionist activities, and they actually reported on the book party, like it was a scandal. And obviously it's because my family have been Washington insiders, and they were worried, like, about what was happening there, and they had good cause for worry because at that book party, you had half of the State Department, a lot of people from the State Department were there, people from progressive organizations like Media Matters, which I used to work for, which I never thought of as like remotely interested in Palestine, had come. All sorts of people who are like aspiring young pundits, progressive pundits had shown up. A lot of people who carried sway within Democratic foreign policy circles showed up. And it was because they're so sick of AIPAC, they were willing to hear what I had to say. And one after another, they came up and shook my hand and said, thank you for what you're doing. Of course, they went out as soon as they, left the house and went out in the street. They didn't do anything because in Washington, it's always a wink and a nod. I always get a wink and a nod in Washington, but I get them. I had actually heard that Wendy Sherman, who was in charge of she was a State Department official under Obama who was in charge of, overseeing the Iran deal. And then she wound up on the DNC platform committee in 2016, shooting down a resolution condemning the Israeli occupation. Someone saw a copy of my book on her bookshelf. So it's like these people are paying attention. I even heard Samantha Power, who is like I consider one of the biggest moral frauds in American history, had a copy of my book. They pay attention, but they don't do anything. The closest thing we saw to anyone with any influence doing anything was Bernie Sanders kind of changing his public line on Palestine and acknowledging that people were suffering badly in Gaza, that Israel had done, in his words, overreacted in Gaza. But it was really important to see someone challenge Hillary Clinton about her pro-Israel bullshit on the national stage. So I don't have a lot of faith in what can happen in Washington. I think people are so disgusted by Netanyahu within Democratic Party circles in Washington and Congress. Netanyahu is a card-carrying Republican. They really see Israel as Netanyahu's Israel, and they see it in the same light as Trump's America.
Interesting.
The kind of bond between Trump and Netanyahu has upset a lot of people. Also, people in the NGO world who are around UNRWA, which is, the organization in charge of Palestinian refugees and educating and feeding them, are in a state of complete panic because they're being defunded for the first time, thanks to Netanyahu's Likudnik son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So there's all of this resentment building, but there's very little action. The question is, when will someone stand up and say in the middle of Congress that it's time for a binational state and it's time for Congress to support sanctioning Israel? We have seen the election um, of some interesting people through the Democratic Socialists of America Party, and they're basically working within the Democratic Party. I don't really know what the DSA is. It has like 40 or 50,000 members. All you have to do is drop $45 and you're a member. But they've been endorsing these candidates who have made interesting statements about Palestine, and they failed to enforce a line on these candidates. And I think this is how, if there is going to be any change in Congress, it's going to be by enforcing a line on these candidates that, left-wing groups like the DSA, which passed a resolution overwhelmingly in support of BDS, actually enforce. So I'll just give you two examples of what happened and what I think needs to happen. The first example is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She had tweeted that what had happened in Gaza when Israel mowed down the Great March of Return marchers was a massacre, and she was elected in a special election or a primary election against Joe Crowley, who had been kind of a J Street Democrat and was more of a kind of establishment Democrat. And everyone cheered and said, yes, this is great. This shows that things are changing for Palestine. And then Ocasio-Cortez proceeds to walk back what she said on Palestine. She didn't know actually what she was talking about when she was asked about the occupation of Palestine. She really struggled, and it seemed that she kind of decided that she should focus on Medicare for all and free college and universal health care and not talk about Palestine anymore. And that was really dismaying for me to see. Then we saw Rashida Tlaib, the first Palestinian woman elected to Congress in Michigan. She is a dues-paying DSA member, and she had taken the endorsement of J Street, and J Street proceeded to announce upon her election that Rashida Tlaib supports all aid to Israel.
Wow.
This was
Was
really
that
this was
actually true? Or
Well, apparently so, because and she had made these really mealy-mouthed statements about we just need to see both sides and empathize with both sides.
hmm.
And this is, in 2018, I can understand, and the amount of discrimination that Muslims and Arab Americans have faced, to want to take this kind of more like, I understand where Jim Zogby's coming from, what you have to do to get into politics as an Arab American in a racist society like this. I can understand someone saying that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but in 2018, after what's been taking place in Gaza with, just how dire the situation is, no. And it was really Ali Abunimah at Electronic Intifada who pushed Rashida Tlaib to walk back this, heinous liberal Zionist position. And many people attacked Ali. Many of the same people, by the way, who were trying to drum out opponents of regime change in Syria from Palestine solidarity circles. Some of them are very conservative people, people that I don't have much in common with politically. And they, really attacked Ali hard for just simply trying to hold her feet to the fire. And in the end, she did walk back her statement. She said that she supports a one-state solution, that she does not support sending aid to Israel, but she referred to it as Netanyahu's Israel, which is a little troubling, but it's an improvement. And it seems likely that J Street will withdraw its endorsement, which is a great thing, because J Street has also been one of the main organizations in trying to drive a wedge within the Palestine solidarity movement. So, Ali really deserves a lot of credit for what he did, and I think it's a model for how these candidates should be treated. We should remember all the hope and trust and almost, faith-based support given to Barack Obama in 2008 when he had provided absolutely zero indication that he would do anything different on Palestine. And what wound up taking place under Obama was that Israel was able to exert more disproportionate force against the Palestinian civilian population than at any time before in history. So it's really important to remember what took place under Obama and to never let it happen again with these DSA, these, really shiny, aspirational DSA candidates.
That's a really good point, and it's something I hope that the community and the movement can come together and, let go of a lot of this divisiveness and hold these candidates to that. So we are out of time now. Thank you very much, Max, for this interview.
Thanks for having me.